Well, thank you everyone for coming here and being a part of the 78th Ohio Communication Association Conference. My name is Tim Pollack. I'll be president for about 2 more hours, and then we'll be passing it on over to Ted. So I'd like to welcome all of you here, be a part of this special keynote presentation. As you know, we have with us Dr. Ron Arnett, who will be giving a talk on the dialogic necessity, acknowledging and engaging monologue. Now, as many of you might know, Dr. Ronald Arnett is a professor and chair of the Department of Communication and Rhetorical Studies at Duquesne University. Recent awards and recognitions include Dr. Arnett receiving the 2006 Everett Lee Hunt Award for outstanding scholarship for his book, Dialogic Confessions, Bonhoeffer's Rhetoric of Responsibility and Communication. Dr. Arnett also received many awards for his teaching and scholarship, including the 2013 National Communication Association Best Book Award for the Philosophy of Communication Ethics from the Communication Ethics Division. But I will also tell you that Ron has a great disregard for neckties, which he shared with me. And I can also tell you, spending an evening with Ron last night, that with all the awards and the teaching and the scholarship and the wonderful thoughts that he shares with us, that he's also a warm, caring, and passionate person when it comes to what he studies and with the people he comes in contact with. In fact, I overheard Dr. Arnett telling Dr. Matthew Smith that we should really just consider him our academic father, Bernstein Bear. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ron Arnett.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to all of you for being here and in this wonderful association that you are gathering together. And I know a number of you, and thank you for being here. This piece is an important element that I composed for you, and for those of you who know my work, dialogue is a central element. I made a move to try to discuss what monologue is in the kind of way in which we need to engage it as a fulcrum for dialogic invitation and possibility. And so what I'm going to do in this piece is to try to lay that out for you in terms of why I think that is important. Hope for the possibilities of dialogue between and among persons has been a persistent anticipation since the devastating and tragic acts of World War I and then World War II. Martin Buber in 1952 stated that dialogue is the hope for this hour. His assertion of more than 60 years ago continues to register as factual in our current world situation. A world in trouble beckons the global community to invite dialogue that meets and addresses the increasing repetitive discounting of those different from us. In my first book on dialogue, Communication and Community, Implications of Martin Buber's Dialogue, I began the first chapter on communicative crisis with a quote from Martin Buber. I would like to quote it. The human being is more than ever inclined to see his own principle in its original purity and the opposing one in its present deterioration, especially if the forces of propaganda confirm his instincts in order to make better use of them. He is convinced that his side is in order and the other side fundamentally out of order, that he is concerned with the recognition and realization of a right, his opponent, however, with a masking only of selfish interests. Expressed in modern terminology, he believes he has ideas, his opponent has only ideologies. This obsession feeds mistrust. that incites two camps. Perhaps today the lone difference between Buber's plea and our present moment is that the polarized camps have simply fragmented into multiple factions that are contentious and deny the importance of the other. We are no longer just polarized. We are disintegrated into manifold pockets of disregard. Disregard for any position contrary to our own. This historical moment is defined by escalating disregard and hate continuing to call forth appeals for dialogue. Indeed, I join the champions of this call in our troubled communities, from neighborhoods to points of global tension and crisis. I concur with the hope of dialogue. The question in this historical era for me is, how do we invite dialogue in an augmented era of difference? I contend that the historical moment of disparate narratives and virtues necessitates a shift from conceptualizing monologue as a communication style to that of narrative ground that matters to another. Monologue can no longer be relegated to disparities in communication style. Monologue houses the narrative ground that matters. Monologue is the ground of conviction that figures our identity, a conceptual position akin to that of Charles Taylor in Sources of the Self. Monologue is the narrative ground upon which we stand that constitutes identity for each of us. I contend that in an era defined by narrative and virtue contention, attentiveness to monologue, the ground of importance that matters to self and other, is the pragmatic fulcrum upon which dialogue rests or abides. When one ignores the monologic ground that is important to another, dialogue remains but an optimistic demand emanating from a disposition of narcissistic expectation that the world conform to our current anticipations. My assertion is that dialogue commences with patience manifested in learning from the monologic ground that matters to another human being. Learning about what matters to another does not, of course, assure the reality of dialogue, but an unwillingness to meet and learn from what matters to another and what the other holds dear will inevitably relegate dialogue to the realm of feigned concern that rejects the burden and the inconvenience of learning from what is genuinely different. Now, before I continue to outline the importance of monologue, I will take a respite. I want to talk a little bit about Ohio, and then I will move back into my text. I'm honored to be here at the 78th Annual Ohio Communication Association. I owe much to the state that made possible my education in the communication program at Ohio University. The names of Paul Bose, the then director of the School of Advanced Interpersonal Communication, and Ray Wagner, my advisor and director, continue to influence my personal and professional engagements. Each has been gone too long. They frame my professional direction, linking the field of communication with hope for the human condition. Paul Keller, my undergraduate professor, introduced me to dialogue. He had just published Monologue to Dialogue, Exploration of Interpersonal Communication with Charles Brown. My years with Paul Keller at Manchester ensured a love of ideas. Remarkably, both Paul Bose and Ray Wagner were graduates of Manchester College. These wonderful teachers inspired a love of the field of communication. They understood the necessity of instilling hope for this historical moment. They gave me a conviction that this field, this study of communication, could help ameliorate many of the ongoing struggles in the human community. This conviction continues to propel my career, indeed my vocation, as a communication professor. Ohio University graduated a hopeful 24-year-old who to this day continues to witness about the importance of communication study as a hope for this hour, a dialogic hope. Now, let me frame the way in which I will look at this dialogic hope from the fulcrum of monologue. I tender that dialogue is a continuing hope for this hour, and I will then turn to the opinion section of the New York Times for some element of support. I will review the scholarly landscape of dialogue in general terms. I'll underscore why it is important. Then I will turn to two opinion pieces in the New York Times coming from the opinion piece called The Stone. And I will look at the work of Zizek. The notion of dialogue has been understood as a backdrop of difference. There are numerous schools on the thought of this topic. Generally, the schools of dialogue are tied to major scholars such as Martin Buber, Paul Fier, Hans Gardner, Nell Nades, and Bakhtin. Within the field of communication, there have been major conceptual reviews on dialogic schools. Sisson and Anderson have provided one. I provided one with Grayson and McDowell, talking about the ongoing shifts in the schools of dialogue, adding the work of Arnett and the work of Emmanuel Levinas. The above reviews suggest that these different schools of dialogue exist some general elements of agreement. And I contend that there are four major elements of agreement on what constitutes dialogue. One, relationships between and among persons matter. Secondly, creative perception emerges between, not within, the brilliance of a single person, text, or object. Third, dialogue is defined by meeting, not by imposing information upon another. And fourth, temporal truth belongs to the relationship and cannot be possessed or colonized. These points of agreement suggest a conception of communication that acknowledges the necessity of radical alterity, difference, resistance to ownership and possession. However, in addition to the above points of agreement among the contrasting schools of dialogue, there's a fundamental difference centering on the origin of dialogue. The commencement of communication between persons shifts between those who think dialogue begins when the communication begins and those who contend that the dialogue begins the moment one is situated within a narrative that matters. Excuse me, a monologue of a narrative that matters. And once you understand the monologic character of narrative and why it matters, and how we carry that into a dialogue, it differentiates the schools of dialogue. Those who talk about it as process, and those who talk about it as content. These paradigmatic differences are fundamentally different worldviews. I began this differentiation years ago in an essay called Toward a Phenomenological Dialogue. The overt stress on monologue, however, does not begin until an essay in 2002, in which I began to talk about, it should be 2012, the fulcrum point of dialogue, monologue, worldview, and acknowledgement. I understand that there are fundamental paradigmatic differences between a therapeutic understanding of Carl Rogers and the religious narrative that grounded the discernments of Martin Buber. Rogers is the American version of dialogue. Buber, the continental understanding of dialogue. Coming off a time in which concentration camps, serious death, and important issues frame the background of the discussion of dialogue. This understanding of dialogue, which is driven by the monologic narrative that matters, underscores an opposition to the process of dialogue. Much of my education in the field of communication is still rooted in Dean Martin's a transactional model of communication and in all the discussion of Berlow related to process. Americanized. Style. My comment is that people don't die for style. They die for content. The second paradigm of dialogue begins with the assumption that narrative ground that gives us identity is the origin of any invitation to dialogue. This approach is closer to what is termed continental philosophy. The orientation to dialogue is closer to the corpus of the work of Martin Buber and Gardner, which stresses the inevitability and the essential necessity of bias in dialogue. We bring bias and prejudice to the dialogue, not neutrality. The communicative origin of this perspective commences long before the dialogue begins. The dialogic framework does not originate with the process of communication, but rather with the narrative content of what matters and shapes our identity. This perspective on dialogue assumes that we stand within an ongoing communication that has content roots that are prior to the process of communicative engagement. The dividing line between and among schools of dialogue is a paradigmatic variance over process and content. The process or Americanized version of dialogue is aligned with optimism. Monologic narrative ground invites dialogue via tenacious hope. An initial differentiation of optimism and hope is at the center of Voltaire's use of Dr. Pangloss in Candide. Optimism unifies communication with a culture of consumption. The optimistic consumer alternates between expectation and demand that existence align with his or her expectations. We could not have written dialogic civility in an age of cynicism, in a cynical age, without this base of American communication. Cynicism is fueled by unmet high expectations. Optimism fuels them. Tenacious hope counters them. Cynicism is fueled by unmet high expectations. Optimism with a dialogic communication consumer orientation invites a cynicism when the world moves contrary to one's unstated demands, often ending in the following utterance that I really don't like hearing. Oh my, he or she refuses to do dialogue. Instead of understanding what's the monologue, the narrative ground that matters to another. Instead, why don't you do dialogue with me? The focus shifts from alterity to a narcissistic domain. Dialogue morphs in such a cynical utterance of frustration. It then, as it fails to operate as a social weapon, capable of securing one's own demands. Tenacious hope, on the other hand, is driven by a demanding understanding of a labor of care. This image is represented by a person rolling up his or her sleeves and going to work time and time again, seeking to learn from difference. Tenacious hope rejects a consumer model. Instead, such an orientation opens the world to work that requires participation without any guarantee of outcome. Beginning with what is important to another requires tenacious hope that meeting and understanding the monologic ground that matters to another might open the hallways of dialogue. Such learning offers no guarantee. It does, however, assume that optimism is the home of communicative failure, often, too often. Monologue is the home of what matters and resists the frailty of communicative optimism. The engagement of monologic importance of another requires tenacious hope if the possibility and the invitation of dialogue is to occur. Leaving and learning what matters to another is demanding communicative activity. The differentiation between tenacious hope and optimism is in what I consider Christopher Lasch's most significant work, The True and Only Heaven, which is a critique of progress. Lasch's work is actually being revisited once again in Europe. It has been somewhat forgotten here, but his insights are beginning to be engaged once again. In order to illustrate this understanding of monologue, I now turn to the stone. Critchley, who is the chair of the philosophy at the New School Research in New York, moderates the series. He is the author and co-author of numerous books and is a major voice on narrative themes of disappointment, both in political and religious realms. He's engaged significant critical thinkers, continental thinkers such as Levinas, Heidegger, and continental philosophy in general. His notoriety and his intellectual mobility makes him an ideal moderator for this series called The Stone in the New York Times. When The Stone started, and it's had one start, stop, and another, and I won't go through that. On May 16, 2010, he introduced the following essay. What is a philosopher? The defining characteristic of a philosopher is someone taking the time to think and consider, rejecting a hurried and pressed push for decision, avoiding action without necessary reflection. As my mother would say, if you're in the dark, you should probably walk and move with some element of prudence. Don't run too quickly. This is not a time of great illumination. We cannot forget, however, the price of such thinking. Philosophy kills. Is that not the story of Socrates? Is that not the story of Aristotle needing to flee? The killing of Socrates, the threat against Aristotle, the repeated efforts to silence philosophical thought throughout the human community, from antiquity to the present, defines the life of thinking. There is a risk associated with thinking that leads to insights that are otherwise than social convention. Let me pause for just a moment in which Arnett does a critique of the notion of the social, in which it is a blurring of the public and the private. And she does so coming out of World War II as a Jewish woman who recognized that one needed to differentiate the private from the public, because the public space been so polluted by Nazi ideology. And what permitted her to recognize the danger of the social is that it blurs the two, which works unless you're in a place, in a life, in a moment, in which either the private or the public is simply falling apart. He ends his introductory essay stating the following, that Socrates uses every virtue we can think of to describe what a philosopher is, but he leaves out one: moderation. From the vantage point of this essay, the lack of moderation, he speaks of the importance of listening to people who have monologic conviction about what they consider as right. Because no one dies for dialogue. But people do die for things they really believe in all over the global community. And my contention is, unless we begin to take those monologic impulses seriously, dialogue will be an aesthetic exercise of little assistance. That Stone states that, goes on to do something that I found interesting. He talks about how the Stone, as well as philosophers, must engage in dialogue, and they must avoid the style of monologue. And then, of course, I disagree with Stone. And I talk about the importance of recognizing, yes, dialogue is important. How do we get there? And the way in which I think we get there is recognizing the narratives that generate incredible dissimilarity between and among us. I now want to go to two essays by Zizek that are provided in this. And Zizek is an internationally known scholar. He's been all over the world. He's been referred to as an academic rock star. As someone who is taken seriously not only for his creative interpretations of Jacques Lacan, but for his political work. His notoriety came as he was engaged in politics, and the way in which he critiqued Yugoslavian politics, his willingness to work for a magazine that offered political critique, his willingness to walk out of meetings in protest, and his willingness to run for president of the Liberal Democratic Party. Intellectually in the United States, he is known for his work on the object of ideology, in which he has calls for a return to German idealism, Marx, and even the notion of a Cartesian subject, mind-body differences. His work on ideology is one way of suggesting that monologic narrative ground matters. People die for monologue. I now turn to two of his essays. The first is Mandela's Socialist Failure, December 6, 2013. Zizek acknowledges the incredible contribution of Mandela and his sacrifices in ending apartheid. Mandela made concessions, however, abandoning his socialist principles for capitalistic participation in the global marketplace. Zizek laments in his opinion piece that the miserable life of the poor within South Africa has not changed. Both physical and financial insecurity continue to define the day. The shift of power within the country moved from an old white ruling class to a black one. Zizek wonders if Mandela, however, ever had a chance. in this local community, of altering the capitalistic mechanisms within the country. He cites then Rand's Atlas Shrugged, where she contends that money is the foundation of all good. It makes possible everything. And to ignore this existential fact results in one's own destruction. Zizek ends by reviewing the monologic plea of Rand, stating that communist structures cannot simply abolish market conditions. Communist encouragement of production and exchange are necessary, otherwise capitalistic domination returns with a vengeance and with direct exploitation. Gives us an example of what it means to learn from another and to enhance one's own monologic position. One must attend to the narratives ever so alien to one's own narrative ground. Zizek points to monologue as a narrative ground that matters and functions as the holder of conviction and meaning and learning and painful political compromise. In yet another venture into an unconventional opinion, this was even more controversial. Zizek is not known for walking away from controversy. This one takes us to ISIS. On 2014, September 3, he states the following: ISIS is a disgrace to true fundamentalism. He recounts how artificial boundaries were carved out after World War II that continue to add credence to anti-colonial resistance in the Middle East. Zizek states that the ISIS objective is the enforcement of religious rules without necessarily concern for humanitarian conditions of a people. ISIS ignores the issues in the global community that Foucault called biopower. The question is whether or not ISIS is a pre-modern entity, with Zizek asserting it's not pre-modern, it's a perverted modernism that gives us a witness to the conservative modernisms in the engagement and restoration of the Japanese industrial machine of the 19th century. This form of modernism demands an ideological form of restoration. The hope of a return, the full authority of the emperor. The photo of our leader with an expensive Swiss watch, the discovery of organizational connections and finances and international web presence announces not pre-modernity, but modernity at its height. ISIS rails against the permissiveness in the West only to engage in gang rapes, orgies, and torture and murder of the alien other, the infidels. This is Zizek. Then he pauses. In each one of these cases, he sets this kind of controversial case and then pauses to move back in somewhat different. Zizek states that Nietzsche detailed this drama of differences with his emphasis on the last man. The last man for Nietzsche is the one without commitment, without passion, without monologue, without narrative ground that matters, without anything to die for. That's That's the last man for Nietzsche. Nietzsche is not calling for nihilism. The nihilism that he is putting forth, he is critiquing. Zizek asserts that we are now in a global drama of nihilism, one of it being passive, the other active. You can guess which one we are. We in the West are the Nietzschean last men, immersed in the stupid daily pleasures, while Muslim radicals are willing to risk everything, engaged in the struggle up to their own point of self-destruction. The current split between anemic liberals and impassioned fundamentalists, we no longer find the notion of the best in either. Zizek then returns to his thesis. Is this group genuinely fundamentalist? His contention is no. They lack the absence of resentment and envy. They lack an active indifference to non-believers. Witness the daily testimony of the fundamental beliefs in the Amish or Buddhists. ISIS is, for Zizek, a disgrace to any genuine form of fundamentalism. He does not confuse passionate intensity of the mob with true conviction. He contends the problem is not the standards of the West. This is really powerful. He contends that the problem is not the standards of the West, but the fact that ISIS has already internalized our standards and measured themselves by them. What is missing in this dispute is the person of true conviction, propelled by narratives that matter. We are fighting those who have already absorbed the standards against which we rant, such as the propelling force of envy that leads to violence ever void of genuine conviction. Zizek points to monologic narratives that matter to the point of permitting one to be indifferent to the other and to the contrary. By the way, indifference is central to ethics in the West. It's detailed by Immanuel Kant. It's central to Emmanuel Levin's. Social comparison is not. Monologic fundamentalism gains its power in the act. Monologic fundamentalism gains its power within a monologic narrative, not within the act of social comparison. Stone offers a public space for the discussion of monologic positions that matter, even when it calls into questions things that we consider sacred. In the case of Zizek, genuine monologue houses insights that educate a thoughtful opposition and remind us of the contrast between nihilism and monologue. The latter is the home of what matters. Listen to what matters to another. At times, listen to the point of indifference. As I conclude, I'd like to make Some final points related to the field of communication. To a discipline of communication that I've learned to love in the state of Ohio. First, communication study needs to attend to what genuinely matters. Second, communication study needs to understand what matters to another. That point of entrance into the conversation is the beginning of understanding the conviction that offers the energy both to sustain human community and make it meaningful and to destroy it. Monologue doesn't come with a guarantee. It comes with intensity and passion, good and ill. Finally, communication study needs to